Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Wednesday, January 29th, 2025. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. Report says Trump wants to withdraw from Syria. So according to a report by the Israeli broadcaster Khan, President Trump is planning to withdraw thousands of U.S. troops from Syria. The report said that senior White House officials conveyed a message to their Israeli counterparts indicating that President Trump intends to pull thousands of U.S. troops from Syria. The report added that a U.S. troop withdrawal from Syria would raise significant concerns in Tel Aviv. So the Israelis are not happy about this reported plan. And not long before Trump's inauguration, the Pentagon under the Biden administration revealed that it had been lying about the number of U.S. troops in Syria. For years, we heard that there were 900 U.S. troops occupying eastern Syria, and the Pentagon said in December that actually there's 2,000 troops there, which is more than double the number that they were telling us for years and years. So as far as we know, who knows exactly what it is, but the Pentagon says there's 2,000 U.S. troops in eastern Syria, and this is a very dangerous place for U.S. troops to be, always a potential tripwire for, a bigger war, this presence. So during his first term in office, if you know anything about Trump in Syria, there's a history here of him saying that he wants to leave Syria. And so far, I haven't seen him say anything publicly. This is just based on this Israeli media report, but I think there are some signs based on, who he put in charge of the Middle East at the Pentagon that a withdrawal could happen. But anyway, so if you remember, back during his first term in office, Trump said that he would withdraw from Syria, but he ended up reversing his decision after coming under immense pressure from Congress and elements of his administration. So people kind of remember this wrong. They think Trump ordered a withdrawal and that his people refused to do it and that they lied to him about the fact that there were still U.S. troops in Syria. But essentially what happened was Trump ordered the withdrawal of U.S. troops from a certain part of northeast Syria where Turkey and the groups that it backed launched an offensive against the Kurds. And he said he wanted to withdraw from Syria altogether, but then people in his administration convinced him to stay there. And then he said that he agreed to keep several hundred troops there to secure the oil. If you remember, this is when Trump was like, hey, we're going to stay. We're going to keep the oil in Syria. We later learned that his people did lie to him about the number of U.S. troops in Syria. This is James Jeffrey, who was Trump's Syria envoy. He did an interview with Defense One in 2020 as he was on his way out. And he said, quote, "We were always playing shell games to not make clear to our leadership how many troops we had there," end quote. So again, saying that they were lying to the leadership about the number of U.S. troops in Syria. But Trump did agree to leave a few hundred troops there. So Jeffrey said that the real number of U.S. troops in Syria was a lot more than the roughly 200 troops that Trump agreed to leave in 2019. Jeffrey also discussed how he worked to convince Trump not to withdraw from Syria. He said, quote, "When the situation in northeast Syria had been fairly stable after we defeated ISIS, Trump was inclined to pull out. In each case, we then decided to come up with 5 better arguments for why we needed to stay. And we succeeded both times. That's the story," end quote. And I believe it was 2018. He also said he wanted to withdraw. So there you have it from Jeffrey, how these people in the previous Trump administration were working very hard to make sure a withdrawal did not happen. Now there's still plenty of hawks in certain parts, mostly in the State Department of this new Trump administration when it comes to, people that would want to stay in Syria. But I think a good sign that a withdrawal could happen is the appointment of Mike Domino, who's a former CIA analyst who worked for Defense Priorities. He is the Pentagon's Middle East policy chief, and he is long on record saying that the U.S. should withdraw from not only Syria, but also Iraq, citing the vulnerability, to attacks. That these U.S. troops that are there are really like sitting ducks. And another point I wanted to make here. So Trump's main justification for staying in Syria in 2019 was to keep the oil. But he also said that Israel and Jordan wanted him to stay. He said both countries wanted him to stay in a different section of Syria. And so we're there, and we secured the oil. That's what we're doing there, is because Israel and Jordan want us there, and we got to keep the oil. So hopefully, he doesn't listen to Israel on this one, and this is something that happens. A withdrawal from Syria, because again, it's just a big risk, and there's a big mess in the northeast now between Turkey and the Kurds. And it's just, not a conflict that the U.S. needs to be involved in. All right, so the next one here, Israel says it will occupy southern Syria indefinitely. So I started with the good news, and now here's some bad news. So Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz said on Tuesday that Israel will indefinitely occupy areas of southern Syria it captured after the regime change in Damascus that ousted former Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. Katz made the comments while visiting Israeli troops on the Syrian side of Mount Hermon, which is located on the Syria-Lebanon border. He said, quote, "The IDF will remain at the summit of the Hermon and the security zone indefinitely to ensure the security of the communities of the Golan Heights in the north and all the residents of Israel," end quote. So you see Katz surrounded by these IDF soldiers up on the mountain. All of the IDF soldiers' faces are blurred because that's the new policy after all these war crimes probes of Israeli soldiers traveling abroad. So Israel has occupied the Golan Heights since 1967 and annexed the territory in 1981, and that was not recognized by any country until the first Trump administration did it in 2019. So Israel began its latest land grab in Syria, again, after the regime change in December. It was still just about a month and a half ago since that happened. It feels like longer ago. But anyway, Israel began this land grab, the new land grab in Syria. After that, they captured the buffer zone between the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights and the rest of Syria. And they've also captured several villages in the Quneitra province in Syria, and they're saying, we're not going anywhere. We're staying here indefinitely. And Netanyahu and Israel, they celebrated and even took credit for the regime change that ousted Assad. But they've also used the takeover of Syria by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is an offshoot of al-Qaeda. They've used this as an excuse to invade Syria. So kind of a contradictory position, saying, oh, it's great that Assad is gone. The threat to Israel in Syria is gone, but there might be another threat. So now we have to invade and bomb the place. And that's what they've been doing. Katz said while he was visiting these Israeli troops, quote, "We will not allow hostile forces to establish themselves in the security zone in southern Syria. We will act against any threat. We will not be dependent on others for our security," end quote. And of course, because of the nature of the U.S.-Israel relationship, all these Israeli military operations are backed, underwritten by the U.S. because of all the military aid and political support that the U.S. provides Israel. All right, so the next one here, Turkish strikes kill 12 Syrian Kurdish civilians in past 2 days. So this article is from Jason Ditz. So fighting continues to rage in northern Syria's Aleppo province as the Turkish-backed SNA attacks territory held by the Kurdish SDF. The SDF has continued to report repelling the offensives, though Turkey is increasingly carrying out airstrikes in support of those operations and just generally against Kurdish towns and cities in the area. The SDF has reported 12 civilians killed in the airstrikes on Monday and Tuesday, and dozens more wounded. The largest strike was against the city of Sarin on the east side of the Euphrates River near the Kare-Kozel Bridge, which is the northernmost bridge across the Euphrates in Kurdish control. So this is, again, in northern Syria where all this fighting is happening. The U.S. troops, the U.S. bases are more to the east of where this fighting is happening. And this is something you'll see. This is barely getting any attention, this fighting between Turkey and the Kurds. But if Trump does make a move to withdraw from Syria, all of a sudden people are going to care about the plight of the Kurds. And the Kurds are certainly in a very tough spot, being between Turkey and now HTS. But, it's U.S. meddling and everything that led to a lot of this disaster. And, the U.S. just needs to be not involved in this anymore. And maybe it would make the Kurds more likely to make a deal with either side or something and work something out if the U.S. got out of there. But the fighting continues. And, this is something when Trump tried to pull out or said he was going to pull out in 2019, that was the talking point from, it was like this hysteria about the Kurds in northeast Syria. Under Biden, Turkey launched another offensive in northeast Syria, killed a whole bunch of Kurds. No, and the White House said, Turkey has the right basically to do what they're doing in Syria. That's what John Kirby said. And he did not hear a peep about it from anybody. So now, again, this is happening. But I bet if the U.S. goes to withdraw, we're going to hear a lot more about this conflict in northern Syria. All right, so the next one here, Ukrainian media outlets lose U.S. funding. So major Ukrainian media outlets are asking for donations following the Trump administration's 90-day foreign aid pause, since many of them are funded by the U.S. government. Ukrainian-Canadian professor and researcher Ivan Kachanovsky, and he is a great follow on Twitter for Ukraine information. He's always reading the Ukrainian media. That's how I learned about all these details, just from a few tweets of his, which were very helpful. So Kachanovsky, he noted on X that the Ukrainian online newspaper Strana.ua reported that two outlets, Hromadska and Bihus Info, acknowledged in their fundraising pitches that they lost U.S. funding. Bihus Info, which I might be pronouncing that wrong, they said in a Facebook post that a large portion of the work that they do had been funded by the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID or USAID, depending on what abbreviation you prefer. So this Ukrainian media outlet wrote, quote, "Therefore, now the role of donations from viewers is changing from an alternative source to one of the key ones. What will happen in 90 days, we do not know, but we know one thing. Now is the time to find out whether our work is really needed by Ukrainian society," end quote. So they're basically saying that they wouldn't be able to operate without this funding from the U.S. unless people really step up and start donating. So this one I am struggling to pronounce too. This is the other Ukrainian media outlet. Hromadski said that some of the projects that they implement, their grants have been temporarily stopped and that they're asking for support. And then other major Ukrainian outlets, including Ukrainska Pravda and Detector Media, also began asking for donations following the pause in U.S. foreign aid, but did not explicitly name that as a reason that they're fundraising. So Kachanovsky, who is the author of a book about the Maidan massacre in Ukraine, has a bunch of good information there. He said in his Twitter post that many of the U.S.-funded media outlets whitewashed, the Ukrainian far right and, pushed for war and discouraged negotiations with Russia and smeared any opponents of these things as pro-Russia, as puppets of the Kremlin. And it's just very interesting, this dynamic here. So Kachanovsky wrote on X, quote, "Major Ukrainian media outlets financed by the U.S. and other Western governments, such as Ukrainska Pravda and Detector Media, propagated the war to the last Ukrainian, glorified and whitewashed neo-Nazi-led Azov, the OUN, and the UPA, and smeared anyone who opposed this as Russian agents paid by the Kremlin," end quote. It's just really something, to know that the U.S. is funding all these media outlets. I mean, it's not a surprise, and this isn't anything new. I mean, the NGO, support for these NGOs in Ukraine and media outlets goes back a long ways, especially after 2014, but it goes back before that. The New York Times reported that several humanitarian organizations in Ukraine have had to shut down due to the Trump administration's foreign aid pause. U.S. officials at the U.S. Embassy in Ukraine are asking for exemptions for humanitarian operations in the country, but so far the only known exemptions for this foreign aid pause are for military aid to Israel and Egypt. But the vast majority of military aid to Ukraine goes through the Pentagon, and that does not appear to be affected by this foreign aid pause. Zelensky said the weapons are still flowing. I haven't gotten an answer out of the Trump administration yet. I haven't seen any clarification, but it appears that the weapons haven't been stopped. So they're still fueling the war, but they have paused all this other stuff. All right, so the next one here, the U.S. transfers Patriot missiles from Israel to Ukraine. So this article is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. So the U.S. has moved some of its Patriot missiles from Israel to Ukraine. The interceptors were in storage after Tel Aviv decommissioned its Patriot air defense program. The transfer is the most significant Israeli support for Ukraine since the Russian invasion in 2022. Again, as I mentioned recently, this could be part of the different calculation now that Assad is out. Actually, this report says that Netanyahu approved this transfer back in September, and then it just happened this week. But this is the U.S. transferring this, so this is the U.S. sending missiles, Patriot missiles, to Ukraine still. So the Trump administration is fueling the war, despite Trump's pledge to end it in 24 hours. So the Netanyahu is apparently reluctant to sign off on this agreement. According to Axios, he refused Zelensky's calls for several months before finally agreeing to the transfer in September. And they were worried that Russia could respond by sending more advanced weapons to Iran. All right, so the next one here, I skipped one. I'm all over the place tonight. Netanyahu to meet with Trump at the White House. So Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu will meet President Trump at the White House next week, making him the first foreign leader invited to visit Washington by the new Trump administration. Trump told reporters on Monday that he would be hosting Netanyahu very soon, and the office of the Israeli Prime Minister confirmed on Tuesday that the meeting would take place on February 4th. Ahead of Netanyahu's trip to the U.S., Trump's Middle East envoy, Steve Witkoff, is expected to hold talks with the Israeli leader in Israel. According to the Jerusalem Post, they're expected to discuss Phase 2 of the Gaza ceasefire deal with Hamas. So everything's up in the air, of course, about the Gaza ceasefire deal. Netanyahu says he has a guarantee to resume things if he wants to. And Smotrich is saying that Netanyahu's assured him that after the first phase, they're going to restart everything. So, it's very fragile ceasefire at this point. But, not a surprise that Netanyahu's the first foreign leader that gets the invite. But also not the best sign that he's getting this kind of treatment. All right, so the next one here, Senate Democrats block bill to sanction the ICC for targeting Israeli officials. So on Tuesday, Senate Democrats blocked a bill that would sanction the International Criminal Court, the ICC, over its arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant for their role in the genocidal war on Gaza. The bill, which already had passed through the House, needed 60 votes to advance through the Republican-controlled Senate, but it failed in a vote of 54 to 45. Every Republican voted in favor, but the bill only received support from one Democrat, Israel's man in the Senate, Senator John Fetterman, Democrat from Pennsylvania. He's been extremely supportive of Israel's campaign in Gaza. The only time I've seen him put a suit on was when Netanyahu came to town. Fetterman wrote on X after the vote, quote, "Deeply disappointed by the outcome of the ICC sanctions bill. My vote follows Israel, not the ICC that equivocated the democratically elected leader of our special ally to the terrorists and rapists of Hamas," end quote. So he says, my vote follows Israel. So the ICC also issued an arrest warrant for Mohammed Daif, the head of Hamas's military wing, and the court sought warrants for two other Hamas leaders, Yahya Sinwar and Ismail Haniyeh, but they were both killed by Israel before the warrants were actually issued. So that's why they say, oh, they're comparing them to Hamas. So the bad news here is that Congress is still expected to pass some kind of legislation to sanction the ICC, since Democratic leadership wants to punish the court for investigating Israeli war crimes, but thought the bill brought to the floor on Tuesday was too broad and could lead to sanctions against U.S. allies that are ICC member states or allies that support the ICC case. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer said, quote, "The ICC bill is one I largely support and would like to see become law. However, as much as I oppose the ICC bias against Israel, as much as I want to see that institution drastically reformed and reshaped, the bill before us is poorly drafted and deeply problematic," end quote. So Schumer is saying they want to sanction them, but they had a problem with this particular bill. So it will probably happen eventually. All right, so the next one here, Gaza hospitals receive 48 more bodies. So Gaza's health ministry said Tuesday that over the previous 48-hour period, hospitals in the Strip received 48 more bodies of Palestinians who were killed by Israeli aggression, raising the death toll since October 2023. So the health ministry said that 37 of the bodies were recovered, meaning they were killed before the ceasefire went into effect, and that 11 of the bodies were new fatalities. So the circumstances of these 11 deaths are unclear. We do know that a few Palestinians in the past 2 days were shot and killed by Israeli forces, including on Monday, at least 2 Palestinians, including a 5-year-old girl, were killed by Israeli forces. So the Israeli military has frequently violated the ceasefire, always claiming that its forces opened fire at some sort of threat. Well, in another incident on Tuesday, Israeli troops accidentally killed an Israeli contractor in Gaza. According to Haaretz, the contractor was unarmed and dressed in civilian clothes and was walking towards the Israeli troops, and they shot and killed him. So that goes to show how they're operating in Gaza. They see someone just walking towards them, unarmed, civilian clothing. Hey, they're walking towards us, shoot them. I think it's clear that that's the way they're operating in the areas that Israeli troops are located. So, and then Gaza's health ministry said that the 48 bodies brought its death toll since October 2023 to 47,354, which is considered a significant undercount. The rescue workers say there's at least 10,000 bodies, still missing that they're going to be digging out of the rubble. All right, so the next one here, UNRWA shutdown risks killing Gaza ceasefire. So this article is another one from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. So the head of the UN's Palestinian aid agency, UNRWA, said that Tel Aviv's decision to halt its agency's assistance programs in Israel jeopardizes the Gaza truce and hostage deal. So on Tuesday, Israel's ambassador to the UN said UNRWA would have to cease its operations in Israel when Tel Aviv's law banning the organization goes into effect on Thursday. Ambassador Danny Danon told the Security Council, quote, "UNRWA must cease its operations and evacuate all premises it operates in Jerusalem. Israel will terminate all collaboration, communication, and contact with UNRWA or anyone acting on its behalf," end quote. So UNRWA chief Filippi Lazzarini responded by saying the shuttering of UNRWA in Israel risked causing the Gaza ceasefire and hostage deal to end. He said, quote, "In 2 days, our operations in the occupied Palestinian territory will be crippled as legislation by the Israeli Knesset takes effect. At stake is the fate of millions of Palestinians, the ceasefire, and the prospects for a political solution that brings lasting peace and security," end quote. So UNRWA is the most crucial agency when it comes to delivering aid. They're saying they don't really have, nobody's really in line to replace them. And the reason why it threatens the ceasefire is because part of the deal was getting much more aid into Gaza. So if they can't operate, then the aid levels are going to significantly drop. All right, so the next one here, 24 wounded by Israeli strikes in South Lebanon. So this one is from Jason Ditz. As the extended ceasefire in southern Lebanon gets underway, Israeli fire against civilian targets continues as they had throughout the initial 60-day ceasefire. So it has not really been a ceasefire for Israel, obviously. At least 24 people were wounded on Tuesday in a pair of Israeli attacks on southern Lebanese towns, and the largest attacks were against Nabatea, which saw an Israeli drone attack, and they destroyed a small vegetable truck, according to the reports. The toll has continued to rise in this attack, with multiple vehicles apparently damaged. So they're claiming that the vegetable truck was a Hezbollah truck and carrying weapons, but of course Israel has provided no evidence for that. And this comes just a couple days after Israel shot and killed 24 civilians who were trying to return to southern Lebanon on the day that Israel was supposed to be out of there. And there's some numbers here. So since the ceasefire began, about 2 months ago, 61 days ago, or 62 days ago now, Israel has killed at least 83 people and wounded 228 others on Lebanese soil. I mean, that's basically the rate that they were killing people in Lebanon before they escalated back in September. So obviously it's one side has not ceased firing, and Hezbollah has not responded at all. At one point they fired 2 rockets that just landed in an open area, but there's always the risk of this thing exploding even more and turning into a full-blown war again. All right, so the next one here, Trump orders the development of a U.S. Iron Dome. So this is very silly, a very silly thing, I think, that President Trump did here. And this was on Monday that he signed an executive order to build a major new missile defense system for the United States, a project that would have a huge price tag and likely fuel a new arms race. Trump has dubbed the plan the Iron Dome for America, likening it to Israel's Iron Dome missile defense system. But the Iron Dome that Israel uses is designed to intercept very crude rockets, short-ranged, unguided rockets, the type of things that Hamas fires. And Trump is envisioning a system that can intercept the most advanced missiles in the world. And the United States is a little bigger than Israel. Israel's a very small country. When he was talking about this idea on the campaign trail, he says, they got this Iron Dome, they can't, that protects the whole country. That's his thinking, is that he wants something like that for the U.S. So the order directs Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth to submit a plan for a next generation missile defense shield that can defend the U.S. against ballistic, hypersonic, advanced cruise missiles, and other next generation aerial attacks from peer, near peer, and rogue adversaries. The order also specifies that the system must include space-based interceptors. So we're talking big money here, a boondoggle for the weapons makers. And a fact sheet released by the White House said the missile shield would guarantee the U.S.'s second strike capability, referring to the ability to respond to a nuclear attack with another nuclear attack. The White House said that Trump was fulfilling a campaign promise by signing the order. One of the quotes from his campaign trail, he vowed to, quote, build a great Iron Dome over our country, a dome like has never been seen before, a state-of-the-art missile defense shield that will be built entirely in America, end quote. So I put a quote in here from Daniel Larison, who's a contributor to antiwar.com. This is from his website, UNRWA, an article that he published there. He said that the missile defense project could fuel an arms race by, quote, pushing other states to expand their missile force so that they could overwhelm whatever defenses the U.S. might create. The only things that the U.S. would get from massively expanding its missile defense systems is a lot more debt and arms races with other nuclear weapons states, end quote. And that's exactly right. That's the, I mentioned the anti-ballistic missile treaty that the George W. Bush administration withdrew from in 2002. That was a treaty that limited the amount of anti-ballistic missile systems that each side could have. I believe they could only really have one. So then, the idea is if Russia knows it can fire ballistic missiles into the U.S. and destroy the U.S., and they know that the U.S. can fire missiles into Russia that would destroy Russia, it reduces the need to build more nuclear missiles. That's the idea here. And since Bush withdrew from that in 2002, we've seen the U.S. and Russia develop new missile systems and everything. So this is a step away from this idea is a step away from denuclearization, this thing that Trump was saying he's interested in. Who knows? Maybe this is, one of his negotiating tactics, but I don't know. I mean, this is something he talked about a lot on the campaign trail, and he's actually trying to do something here, but the price tag is going to be absolutely huge. All right, so the next one here, Romania's voided TikTok election. So this article is from Dropsite News by Alexander Zajcik. So this is something I didn't cover enough. I think I kind of briefly mentioned it, but of Romania's election being canceled because the wrong candidate won. And this was Călin Georgescu. He's a right-wing populist candidate who was not expected to win, but he won. And they canceled the election, and even the Romanian Constitutional Court overturned the results. And it was cheered on by the U.S., by the West, by the rest of Europe. And they didn't cancel the election results over claims that there was fraudulent votes or anything like that. It was over claims that this TikTok campaign swayed the election and claims that the TikTok campaign went back to Russia, which is, not grounds to cancel an election, even if there was some social media campaign like that. But this gets into the details. I would recommend you just go read it. It's really crazy. Essentially, what it boils down to here is that the claim was that this TikTok campaign, there was all this viral stuff related to this candidate, Georgescu, that was happening. And it was investigated, and there was no evidence that it went back to Russia. It was actually paid for and funded by a different party, one of the liberal Democrat parties that was apparently, the idea was they were trying to boost this guy, Georgescu, because, it was similar to how the Hillary Clinton campaign boosted Trump because they thought he would be easy to beat. And it was apparently a similar situation here. So this is a huge scandal, and it's just not getting any attention. All the other European countries have basically said, I'm sure there were some outliers like Hungary, Slovakia, but they supported canceling this election because, essentially because you had this candidate who was skeptical of NATO. He's not saying that he wants Romania to leave NATO, but he doesn't want NATO bases in his country and things like that. And the NGO that made these claims about the Russian, tying the TikTok thing back to Russia was funded by the U.S. And there was just no evidence that Russia was involved in this TikTok thing at all. But that's the whole that's what they canceled an election over. I mean, it really is a big deal, and this is the first EU country to do to cancel an election. So again, it's just a huge deal what happened here, and you just barely hear anything about it. All right, so that is it for the news for today. Please go check out our viewpoints. One from Ted Snyder, Trump and Ukraine, the coming battle over conscription. One from Karen Greenberg, the true cost of Guantanamo. One from Ramsey Baroud, Gaza's unbreakable resistance, a historical perspective on the war and its aftermath. One from Kit Clarenberg, collapsing empire, RIP CIA fronts overt operations. About the National Endowment for Democracy. They took down their database of all their programs around the world. I noticed that when I was trying to find out what they funded in Georgia. Our spotlight from Anel Sheline, Trump can't clean out Gaza without destabilizing the region. So that was a lot of stuff to go over. So much seems to be happening, and I'm sure I'm missing things as well. A lot of fighting now in the Democratic Republic of Congo. The M23 rebels are on this big offensive. I haven't even talked about that, but we've had lots of stories on that. If you're interested in the situation there in the Congo, you could go to the lower part of antiwar.com and see the different stories about that. But anyway, you could always support us by liking, subscribing, commenting. All that stuff helps out. Follow us on social media, Instagram, X, TikTok. One thing I want to mention, I'm going to write a story on this soon, the Defend the Guard, the legislation at the state level that would prohibit the federal government from deploying the National Guard to an area where Congress hasn't declared war, to a combat zone where Congress hasn't declared war. It's been introduced in a whole bunch of states recently with this new year. So they're looking for people to phone bank. So I always put the link to the phone banking in the description of this show. So if you really want to do some anti-war activism, it's a great way to do it. It's always in the description, or you can go to defendtheguard.us to just kind of learn more about it. Anyway, I'll be back tomorrow with some more news. Thanks for listening.